Greetings everyone and welcome to another episode of Military in Painful Detail. The third episode of this series is a bit shorter than the previous ones. In today's video we will discuss the plans for modernizing the Royal Navy in the interwar period. You might ask yourself what this has to do with the history of Bismarck and Operation Rheinübung. The answer to this question is in fact quite complex. First, this material will give us an insight into how the future conflict at sea was viewed in Great Britain, what threats were anticipated and how they wanted to counteract them. Second, it will give us an insight into the weakness of the Royal Navy. The weakness of a navy which is often presented as a very powerful force, when in reality the situation of the British fleet was much more dramatic. And finally, we will see what technical innovations were intended and implemented on British ships. I have placed this material between the videos describing HMS Hood and the Nelson class and the King George class battleships, since the latter, as completely new ships, were not subject to these plans. So, let's see what plans the Royal Navy had for the ships that had to face Bismarck in World War II. The modernization of the Royal Navy during the interwar period was governed by two factors: treaties and money. Great Britain, as the main signatory of the Washington and London agreements, should theoretically follow these provisions as strictly as possible, even though other powers had more liberal approach to it. Therefore, both new designs and modernization of existing ships had to strictly adhere to the provisions of the treaties. The modernization of the fleet took place in two stages. The first stage was in force until the First Treaty of London in 1930, and the second stage was in force after that treaty. The Royal Navy in the era of the Washington Treaty became a fleet armed with 15-inch guns. Warships equipped with smaller main artillery were mostly scrapped, and the few that survived were placed in reserve or for training, such as the King George class, the Iron Duke class super dreadnoughts, Lion class, and the HMS Tiger battlecruisers. This left the fleet with some artillery uniformity, which facilitated staff training, logistics, and planning. The striking force of the Royal Navy consisted of battleships of the Queen Elizabeth class with 5 units and the Revenge class, sometimes also known as Royal Sovereign class, also 5 units, as well as Renown class battlecruisers, 2 units, HMS Hood, and the newly built Nelson class battleships. This all summed up to a total of 15 capital ships. In the first period, until the 1930, the Queen Elizabeth class and to a lesser extent the Revenge class were modernized. HMS Hood was freshly commissioned, and the changes to Renown class were actually treated as the completion of the construction process of these ships. Considerations on what to do with existing ships began in April 1922. The budget was very limited, so the work only concerned ships considered prospective, which meant armed with 15-inch guns. But even these ships were modernized much more austere than in the other navies. The work mainly concerned anti-torpedo and anti-aircraft defense. The first aspect, modernization of anti-torpedo defense system, was actually limited to installing anti-torpedo bulges on ships that did not have them yet. During this work, it was planned to further strengthen the deck armor to improve the ship's defense against bomb attacks. When the ship was in shipyard to install anti-torpedo bulges, it was possible and practical to also work on strengthening said armor. Unfortunately, the Empire's finances did not allow for such extravagance. At the same time, it was not agreed to delay work on anti-torpedo protection, arguing that practically any war will certainly involve weapons like torpedoes or mines, while anti-aircraft defense, in this case deck armor, comes into play practically only in the context of a war with one of the great powers. Therefore, for practically entire 1920s, nothing more than the installation of anti-torpedo bulges was done. The second aspect of modernization was anti-aircraft defense. This was related not only to the deck armor, which as mentioned remained untouched until after the Treaty of London, but also to the installation of new anti-aircraft guns and their guidance systems. This in turn involved the modernization of the superstructures. The anti-aircraft aspect was taken very seriously by the Royal Navy during this period. A special commission was established to prepare reports on threats from aircraft, methods of combating aircraft, and planning the best armor and passive defense schemes. It is true that immediately after World War I, there were no demands for such huge anti-aircraft artillery batteries as on American warships in 1944 and 1945. The proposed changes were much more modest. Installation of special rangefinders and anti-aircraft fire control systems, like for example HACS, High Angle Control System, and replacement of existing 3-inch guns, 76mm anti-aircraft guns with new 4 inches 102mm guns, plus the addition of 2 more mountings for them. The whole thing was to be finished by adding well-known pom-poms, although they appeared much later than expected. High-angle control system was to be installed at the top of the mainmast with the assumption that it would have an ideal place for observing the sky. Later, a second HACS was also added to the aftmast. Some problems were caused by the position where anti-aircraft guns were to be installed. Initially, the twin 4-inch guns were to be operated entirely manually, loading, elevating and transversing, as required by the Royal Navy. This meant that the firing frequency or the rate of fire of twin guns was lower than that of a single gun. Gradually, BD positions between deck positions were replaced with the UD position, upper deck positions. The ships then had 4 positions with twin 4-inch anti-aircraft guns and 2 pom-pom mountings. In addition, there are 2 high-angle control system stations placed high on masts. Meanwhile, 1930 and the conference in London were fast approaching. As part of the Washington Treaty, the holidays from building new ships of the line, new battleships, were extended, and thus the service of existing ships was also extended. In such circumstances, more complicated and more comprehensive modernizations began to be considered. The first ship to benefit from this was HMS Barham. HMS Barham was the last of the Queen Elizabeth class which was to receive anti-torpedo bubbles and enhance anti-aircraft defense. This time, however, it was additionally equipped with reinforced deck armor, reaching up to 4 inches above the magazines. In addition to defending against bombs, it also strengthened the defense against shells fired from longer distances. HMS Hood, which was modernized in 1921, left the shipyard virtually unchanged 2 years later. In fact, it was mostly maintenance work, mainly related to propulsion system. New high-angle control systems and anti-aircraft rangefinders were installed, 2 pom-poms and 2 small rangefinders were also added to them. And the platform with the plane from the X tower was dismantled. Instead, a catapult was installed on the aft deck, which was probably the worst place on the ship where one could be mounted. HMS Hood had gained some weight in 1931 and had become quite a wet ship. Therefore, the aft deck was constantly flooded, and operating the catapult from there must have been a nightmare. No wonder the entire installation was dismantled a year later in 1932. Unfortunately, the first and only chance for a thorough modernization of the ship was completely wasted. For example, the installation of more modern main artillery fire control system, HMS Hood entered World War II with a targeting system actually from the previous war. Much more was achieved on the remaining ships. The only thing left to do was to decide which of the 2 existing classes of battleships is better suited for modernization, Queen Elizabeth class or the Revenge class. Ultimately, the Queen Elizabeth class was chosen based on many small differences. The Elizabeths, for example, were slightly more stable, had a bit more space on board for anti-aircraft guns, had better combat platforms and a longer range at higher speeds. These small advantages seem to outweigh any advantages in the Air class armor. The Queen Elizabeth class had three of its ships completely rebuilt: HMS Warspite, HMS Queen Elizabeth, and HMS Valiant. HMS Malaya was rebuilt in simpler way, like HMS Barham. The biggest problem faced by planners and politicians was the fact that, on the one hand, the ships clearly required major modernization to remain useful, and on the other hand, some are approaching the end of their planned service, even after the ship's service lives has been extended. Thus, for example, HMS Valiant, which was eventually rebuilt, would theoretically have served for only 6 years after its completion. It was necessary then to approach the issue of which ship to modernize and which ones to leave with the thought that they would soon be replaced by new battleships. The reconstruction of HMS Warspite, the first of the Queen Elizabeth class to be fully rebuilt, was a prototype of this type of work on other ships. The guidelines were presented by a special committee, the Committee for the Modernization of Existing Warships, as it was named. The main points were as follow: increase the elevation angle of the main artillery guns to increase the range by 5,500 yards. Replace the existing 15-inch shells with new ones with increased penetration and range at the expense of the amount of ammunition taken on board. Replacement of 6-inch secondary artillery and 4-inch anti-aircraft artillery with a universal one, 4.7 inches, later 4.5 inches. Installation of new director control towers, DCT, 2 per side. Increase short-range and anti-aircraft weapons to 4 8-barrel pom-poms and 4 12.7 machine guns. Installation of new fire control center for the main battery, primarily the new analog computers AFCT Admiralty Fire Control Table. Installation of a catapult and a hangar for at least 4 aircraft. Replacing the underwater torpedo tubes with quadruple ones placed on the deck, 1 set per side. Improvement of deck armor and anti-torpedo defense. Modernization of the engine room and boiler room, increasing pump efficiency. Modernization of the combat bridge to reduce crowding and improve command at night. Installation of HFDF devices. Installation of 6 mechanical and stabilized reflectors. And finally, removal of the armored command bridge. Unfortunately, in case of HMS Warspite, it was not possible to install the universal secondary artillery. The ship was already too far advanced in shipyard work, and there was no point in delaying it. Of great interest is the requirement of the Royal Navy to carry large numbers of seaplanes on its ships. Even cruisers had to be able to carry up to 5 seaplanes. The explanation is in fact quite interesting. After the Washington and London treaties, in which the regulations limited the number of aircraft carriers in fleets, the Royal Navy tried to strengthen its air component by using planes taking off from battleships, cruisers, as well as aircraft carriers. And not only in terms of providing reconnaissance, they worked on catapults that would allow heavy planes armed with torpedoes and bombs to take off. Theoretically, a squadron of battleships and cruisers could have quite an impressive number of such offensive seaplanes. Modernization of the engine room and boiler room was another key stage. Work on this element of the ship not only brought huge weight gains, but also freed a significant amount of space. This was also important from the point of view of ship survivability, where an underwater hit was now less likely to result in the loss of a ship, as was the case with the HMS Audacious. We also need to answer the question, why was so much emphasis placed on rebuilding the combat bridge and equipping the ship with searchlights for night fighting? By the early 1930s, the Royal Navy realized that their achievements in fire control systems and plotting fleet movements gave them huge advantages in night combat. Thus, they changed their policy from avoiding a night clash to seeking one. This was later implemented with brutal efficiency during the World War II, especially on the Mediterranean Sea. After HMS Warspite, HMS Renown was modernized, completely changing its appearance and significantly increasing its capabilities, while also gaining a very pleasant profile. After HMS Renown, HMS Queen Elizabeth entered the shipyard. Afterwards, it was planned to modernize HMS Hood, but this did not happen, so instead of HMS Hood, HMS Valiant, the third of the Queen Elizabeth class, was modernized. In the case of these ships, universal 4.5-inch caliber artillery has already been used, not like in the HMS Warspite. In the interwar period, Hood was the most powerful battleship of the Royal Navy. For this reason, she was quite a busy ship, traveling frequently and representing Britain's power around the world. However, Hood was slowly getting old and needed modernization. The fighting conditions have changed, new targeting systems were created, radar took its first steps, larger calibers appeared, battles took place at greater distances. The situation on the battlefield, on the basis of which Hood was designed, changed. The ship needed to be adapted to this new reality. The Admiralty realized that mighty Hood was mighty only on the surface, pun intended, but they could not afford to withdraw it from service for the long period needed for modernization, and they did not have additional finances at their disposal. Other ships needed rebuilding more to remain fit for service at all. Throughout the 1930s, HMS Hood underwent cosmetic changes, mainly the removal of the 5.5-inch 140mm secondary artillery guns, replacing them with 4 inches anti-aircraft guns. In 1940, all 140mm guns were finally removed. 5 UP launchers were installed on the ship, and a total of 7 twin 4-inch gun mounts were installed on the battlecruiser. Space was made on the mainmast for a rangefinder position for the AFCT Mark VII, which was unfortunately not installed, and spall shields were added for the 4-inch boat deck guns and pom-poms. In the final modernization, January-March 1941, Hood received 2 radar sets, Type 279 Air Search and Type 284 for fire control. The ship now displaced 48,360 tons, and that would be all that was done on the ship practically from the moment it entered service. So this was the actual state of affairs and what was planned for the pride of the Royal Navy. In 1936, the controller drew attention to the elephant in the room, which was the aging of HMS Hood, and asked what the possibilities were for its modernization in 2 variants, a modest one and a full reconstruction. At this stage, however, no sensible concept has emerged. It must also be said that similarly to Queen Elizabeth class, it was not entirely obvious that Hood needed to be modernized. The ship was scheduled to be decommissioned in 1948. Due to shipyard schedule, the possible reconstruction could start in 1940 at the earliest, and possibly even as late as 1942. Theoretically, modernizing Hood could cost a lot, and the ship could serve only 3 years after modernization. A complete reconstruction would make sense if the ship remained in the service longer. Therefore, 3 not 2 reconstruction schemes were prepared, ranging from very modest through moderate to full. The first real consideration about the modernization of HMS Hood can be dated back to July 1937. It was determined that a complete reconstruction of the ship's superstructures, modeled on those of the HMS Warspite, was possible, along with the installation of universal or twin-purpose secondary artillery, additional pom-poms, and 20 12.7mm machine guns, as well as a catapult amidships and modern fire control systems. The engine room remained in good condition. It was estimated that it would last until 1950, but modernization of the boiler room and repiping of the ship would be necessary for continued service. However, if a full modernization of the propulsion system, both engine room and boiler room, were carried out, significant weight savings could be achieved, enabling other characteristics of the ship to be improved. The issue of increasing armor is also interesting. The most profit would be from removing the 5-inch belt, strengthening it in places where it was 7 inches thick to 12 inches, and increasing the deck armor. The latter could be achieved in a number of ways depending on the tonnage available, but the main idea was to replace the existing defense of 3 1-inch armored decks with 1 3-inch or 4-inch plate. In addition, the universal artillery could be changed to 5.25 inches as in the King George class battleships. In January 1939, the controller ordered designers to focus on full reconstruction. 2 armor schemes were considered. Scheme A, in which the 5-inch armor is removed, the 12-inch belt is raised to the main armor deck, and deck armor above the engine room is increased to 2.5 inches and above the magazines to 4 inches. Scheme B, on the other hand, left a 7 inches side armor strip but increased the deck thickness to 5 inches above the magazines and 4 inches above the engine room. The DNC preferred option A, arguing that 7-inch armor had low value, 12-inch armor is better protected the barbettes and sides of the ships, and also for better weight distribution, which was important on a ship that was already quite overweight. Anti-torpedo defense would remain virtually unchanged, except that the anti-torpedo bulges would be modified as in the newest battleships, which mean extended. Hood speed would remain at 31.5 knots, 30.75 knots at full displacement, and her displacement would be reduced by 200 tons to just over 48,000 tons. Unfortunately, this reconstruction did not take place. In 1939, given the rapidly deteriorating political situations, depriving the Royal Navy of such an important warship was a difficult decision. However, the First Lord of the Admiralty pressed for this reconstruction to take place. If the ship were to serve another 15 years, as seemed likely, it would be an unspeakable loss if the ship was not rebuilt. Unfortunately, all reconstruction plans were suspended in May 1939, and HMS Hood went into World War II unprepared for what was coming. Nelsons were the youngest Royal Navy battleships in service throughout the interwar period. Therefore, any modernization of these ships began to be planned only in July 1936, around the time when planning the modernization of HMS Hood began. The modernization plan focused on eliminating the ship's Achilles heel, the weak frontal armor deck. Theoretically, a shell with a steep trajectory fired from a long distance could penetrate the thin deck armor in front of the barbettes of the turret A and reach the magazines. The second aspect was the replacement of secondary and anti-aircraft artillery with universal double-purpose one with uniform caliber. The main assumptions of the modernization were also consistent with what the Admiralty was introducing on all its heavy warships. In the case of Nelson type, however, their unusual shape also dictated some variations in the previously established pattern. In July 1937, HMS Nelson was at Portsmouth for maintenance and repairs. The cabling was replaced and the existing Mark I high-angle control systems were replaced with new Mark III ones. Most importantly, it received additional armor on the lower bow deck. Thus, the threat of magazine penetration from front has been slightly reduced. HMS Rodney, which came into dock after Nelson, was also due to receive a similar upgrade, but unfortunately nothing came of it. As with HMS Hood, a major reconstruction was planned for 1941, maybe 1942. Plans A, B and C were prepared from minimum to maximum. The minimum plan, Plan C, assumed unification of the secondary artillery up to increasing the caliber up to 5.25 inches, adding more pom-pom positions and better positions for DCT, Director Control Tower, and it was planned to mount a catapult on the X Tower. The other two plans, A and B, were more extensive. They differed slightly from each other, mainly in the location of the secondary artillery. Plan B was conservative, with secondary artillery placed aft and around the superstructure, Plan A was innovative, with 4 positions placed at the stern, 2 per side, and 4 positions placed forward of the turret A, also 2 positions per side. This of course affected the possibilities or the range of firing from turret A, but the range of angles available for this turret was considered sufficient, and even if it were not, the 5.25-inch mount could be sink into the deck, which would provide an interesting view if nothing else. In addition, the boiler room and engine room were to be modernized. The ship would have a top speed of 25.5 knots with a power of 70,000 shp and a standard displacement of 36,000 tons. During this period, Great Britain began to prepare for the upcoming conflict. Thus, the armament industry received more financial resources for its needs. Due to the greater scope of available finances, modernization of the armor belt on Nelson class was also considered. During this period, the D&C was conceived that the belt should be on the outside, less sloped but thicker. He planned to dismantle the existing armor, which would be a very long and a very costly, expensive operation, and in its place install a new and thicker armor, 40 inches for magazines and 13 inches for the engine room, but it should also be placed outside. Plus additional reinforcement for the armor deck and the addition of the additional armor deck to protect against shrapnel. Unfortunately, also nothing came of these ambitious plans. The political situation was deteriorating fast, and the ships were considered too necessary for the fleet at the moment to withdraw them from service for over 2 years. The planned modernization would also be very expensive, approximately £3 million per ship. Again, the Nelson class, like HMS Hood, entered World War II without major modernization, practically in condition in which it was commissioned. HMS Rodney did not even complete the basic maintenance work that the Nelson did in 1937. Even more limited modernizations were the subject of the Revenge class concerns, but due to their limited role in our present lecture, we can in fact ignore them. Suffice it to say that little has been done on them. And here we will end today's material. I think that this episode gives us a good background for further analysis, especially in the future episodes that will be devoted to the course of Operation Rheinübung. Now we have 2 more episodes devoted to the projects, to the designs. In the next material we will look at the process of creating Bismarck, and in the 5th episode we will look equally closely at the British King George class battleships. I hope that you liked today's film and that we will see you soon in the next episode of Military in Painful Detail.